Are people actually leaving the shores of freedom in order to search for a better life just south of the border? Apparently, statistics show that when you look at the 13 countries with the most Americans living abroad as expats, you'd find that Mexico is topping the list by a massive margin. In fact, the margin between the amount of Americans living in Mexico compared to other countries is so wide that the figures of Americans living in Mexico outnumber the combined total of Americans living in the next 5 countries on the list. How did this happen? What made Mexico so attractive to the Americans who have touted their country to be the best in the world for decades, if not centuries? Especially for a country who, it would be fair to say, needs a lot of PR, especially in areas concerning violence and security thanks to poverty and crime. Furthermore, what do the locals think of the invasion of their neighbors from up north? Join us as we take a look at why Americans are searching for a better life in Mexico. I know, right? With all the reports of all the violence and insecurity that seems to occur in Mexico thanks to poverty and crimes committed by forces like the Mexican drug cartel, Mexico seems to be one of the last places that people may want to relocate to. Such violence has put a strain on the country's strong selling points. For starters, those who have had a first-hand experience of visiting Mexico have impressed people so much, Americans have decided to let go of their preconceived notion of their southern neighbors. The beautiful country that is Mexico. Apparently, if you ask these American immigrants what made them think that Mexico would be the ideal destination for their relocation, the first response from a good number of them seems to be that they loved the warmth, the vibrance in the Mexican culture, and the sense of community that seems to come from said culture. Thanks to such factors, such people have ignored the higher crime rates in the country when compared to those back home. In fact, you'd find that data from the U.S. State Department actually shows that 1.6 million Americans now call Mexico home. This actually makes them the largest immigrant group in Mexico, and as we alluded to earlier, the largest American community abroad. Incredible, right? Upon closer inspection, you'd find that a good number of these American immigrants live in Guadalajara, one of the most populous and densely populated cities in Mexico. Again, how did this happen? The answer at the tip of everybody's tongues seems to be that Mexico has a wide variety of attractions and experiences that seems to appeal to the general public. Firstly, people are starting to acknowledge the affordable cost of living in Mexico. Aside from that, Americans could apparently get used to the more laid-back lifestyle that they observed in Mexico. Additionally, the mix of bubbling towns, world-class resorts, breathtaking beaches, breathtaking landscapes, and awe-inspiring historical landmarks have people looking forward to starting their new lives in Mexico. When you consider such factors, can you really blame them for taking the gamble on Mexico? Add the warm and friendly nature of the locals that has proven to be part and parcel of daily life in Mexico. Even newcomers begin to feel that this is their true home. Turns out that this is not an act because such warm values are entrenched in Mexico's strong sense of community. Apparently, this sense of community isn't just limited to family members, it's also the way locals relate to their neighbors and the wider community as a whole. For example, you'd find that major life events, be it a quinceañera or a funeral, are rarely experienced in isolation. Instead, such events are inclusive of everyone, even foreigners who may have just found their way into the country. As such, you can see why many Americans may be intrigued by this close sense of community, especially as more often than not, they may have experienced a more secluded or private life experience. Attractive financial incentive. As appealing as Mexico's landscape and culture may be, it may not be as appealing as the financial motivation that many Americans may see in living in Mexico, especially when you consider the cost of living in the U.S. This motivation can be seen in several different areas, such as housing, feeding, utilities, and taxes. As you can imagine, this is highly motivational for Americans who have been forced to carry the burden of the constantly rising rates of these living costs, in contrast to their stagnant wages and salaries. Those on fixed incomes in particular will be able to tell you how much this hurts them. Considering the ever-rising cost of living, in contrast to the declining value of the average American's income, nobody can be surprised that Americans may look to Mexico as a solution to the cost of living crisis. After all, they'd find that the cost of living in Mexico is 45.7% lower than that in the U.S. Add the favorable exchange rate between the dollar and the peso, and you'd find that Americans can actually get more value for their money living in Mexico. You may hate to hear it, but it's clear that a seemingly modest salary in the U.S. may actually give one a decent, if not more than average life in Mexico. This becomes especially clear when they realize that not only does their money have more value in Mexico, but that most expenses, such as the utilities and feeding that we mentioned earlier on, costs considerably less in Mexico. Sometimes it's barely even a fraction of what these same things cost in the U.S. Let's actually take a closer look at this. Let's look at housing, for example. Apparently, the average cost of renting an apartment in one of the most sought-after areas in Mexico City, the capital city of Mexico, is about $500 a month. Compare that to the price of a basic apartment in New York City, and you'd have to stop your head from spinning. In New York, it's supposedly 4 to 5 times more expensive to find something more basic than the apartment you'd find in Mexico City. When you look a bit deeper into it, you'd find that homeownership is also more difficult to achieve in the US than in Mexico, especially because of the increasingly more expensive costs of acquiring homes in the US, especially in the last decade. As if that isn't bad enough, the property tax in respect of these homes in America have risen at rates that have even surpassed that of inflation. This leaves homeowners scrambling again and again just so that they could cover these increasingly rising taxes. Let's not even talk about the rising costs of the maintenance of homes. At this point in time, it just seems to be a never-ending nightmare for those looking to acquire and keep their homes. Let's compare these harrowing circumstances to the conditions in Mexico. Not only are the property taxes relatively lower, but so are the costs of maintaining these homes as well. Apparently, this is mainly because of 2 determining factors. First of all, it appears that the prices of materials in Mexico are a lot cheaper than they are in the US. Secondly, it appears that the cost of labor for home-related services are cheaper as well. This reduces a lot of the financial burden of those who own and maintain homes in Mexico. Trouble-free transportation. As much as the cheaper costs of acquiring and maintaining a home in Mexico may be appealing enough to have people moving across the border in hordes, the cheaper and perhaps healthier forms of transportation may also be persuasive enough to those looking to leave the shores of the United States of America. Unlike a good chunk of the US, most of Mexico is walkable thanks to the pedestrian-friendly streets and sidewalks. For those who may not be up for a stroll, there are many different modes of transportation for the residents of the country, depending on the size of the town. For example, if you find yourself in the resort city of Cancun, you'd find that you could use the bus to get around this scenic destination spot. Apparently, a single bus trip there may cost as little as 50 cents. And if you're there long enough, you could get a monthly pass for about $14 to $17. You could also either use a bike to get around, and if you want something more private and mobile, you could always just get a cab, which is also quite affordable. Affordable health care. Most of us may know this already, but the healthcare system in Mexico seems to be more affordable yet higher in quality than that in the US. This is especially true when it comes to routine services and prescription medication, which has been acknowledged to be significantly cheaper in Mexico. You know you actually can't play with your health, so this is a major factor to consider where you may want to live. Apparently, more than 1 million American citizens travel to Mexico because of these favorable factors every year. According to organizations such as Patients Beyond Borders, people who make this journey down to Mexico end up saving anything between 40% to 65% on their medical bills. Look at that! Apparently, a visit to the doctor could cost you less than $5. If you're looking for a specialist, this could rise up to about $25. That's insane! This principle applies to prescription pills, which apparently are manufactured in Mexico. No wonder people who are in need of long-term access to prescription drugs have decided to make that move to Mexico. That beats making repeated trips across the border just to survive. Sweet weather. As great as the weather might be, it still doesn't beat the beautiful weather that residents experience in Mexico. The sun shines constantly in Mexico, which in turn gives Mexico its tropical climate all year. That's why all the beach lovers can't wait to make their way to the country's coastal towns and cities, which have an average temperature of 24 degrees Celsius to 20 degrees Celsius when they can. And we all know that Americans love beaches. That said, the temperature drops a little when it comes to Mexico's inner cities and highland areas. However, the temperature doesn't plummet in the same way as it does in some parts of the U.S. For example, in some of these highland areas, the weather averages something between 17 degrees Celsius and 22 degrees Celsius during the day and 7 degrees Celsius during the night. To complete the favorable variety of the weather in Mexico, one could turn to coastal cities like Puerto Vallarta, Tulum, and Playa del Carmen for the perfect blend of cool and tropical weather. Add the fact that these beaches have affordable beachside properties on them, and you'd find that it'll be difficult to pry these Americans away from the beautiful spots in Mexico. Convenient remote work. You may find that Americans may also be persuaded to buy affordable homes in these tropical spots because of the opportunity of working remotely in such a beautiful country. This is sort of a blessing because one would find that these days, many companies have given workers the liberty to work from anywhere in the world. Once Americans came to take full advantage of this chance to work from home, they realized that Mexico may just be the place for them, especially when the time zone is similar with that in the US and the proximity to the US allows them to match conveniently with those back home. Controllable safety and security. We cannot ignore Mexico's security profile, especially when it has been sullied by the media as well as TV shows such as Narcos. That said, we cannot ignore the drug cartels that run riot in Mexico. However, as much as these safety concerns have been frequently highlighted, this hasn't stopped Americans from visiting or relocating there. Even though the U.S. State Department still warns Americans as they cross the border, it still hasn't prevented places like Mexico City and Cancun from becoming popular destinations. Interestingly, despite this increase in the influx of Americans into Mexico, it appears to be that a good number of the major cities and popular tourist destinations in Mexico have experienced a reduction in the rates of crime and violence. Be that as it may, tourists must take safety precautions such as avoiding dark, isolated areas in the night, as well as having their guard up in crowded places during holiday seasons because of the heightened potential of criminal activities during such times. Regardless of this, the security agents ensure that Mexico remains a safe tourist destination for many who come over, be it tourists or residents. No wonder many Americans have decided to adopt this beautiful place as their new home. Local reception. As much as many people are happy to make Mexico their new home, it's left to ask what their local Mexicans think of their new neighbors. Unsurprisingly, there are some that have expressed their concern about the effects of the influx of these new residents. Who can blame them? This influx of these new residents from America can be said to be the direct cause of the increase in rent. This has even had the effect of displacing some locals, be it unintentionally. Again, it's understandable that this is a cause for concern to those who have lived in the area for generations. This concern has been evident in the form of public criticism of what's going on. As much as there are some that are complaining about what may amount to the gentrification of their nation, there are others who cannot ignore the financial benefits of the entry of these Americans, especially when they consider the fact that the places where these Americans created a community because they found that this improved the local economy in these areas. Seems to many like a symbiotic relationship. Americans can make a new base close to home, and the locals may be able to benefit from the influx of dollars into the local economy. Let's see how this growing relationship develops. With that, this video has come to an end. Looks like the US is not the only one struggling with its economy. What do we mean? Why don't you watch our video about why the strong Dutch economy is slowing down? Tired about talking about the economy? Take a look at Sam Bankman-Fried, the genius who became a fraudster. Don't forget to like and subscribe as well. Until next time, goodbye.